As ICE operations in Minnesota grab national headlines, some Maine cities believe they're next. Rumors continue to circulate about plans for ICE to come to the state, including the possibility of operations in Lewiston, the hometown of Congressman Jared Golden. The representative for CD2 said in a statement he's aware of the rumors about potential ICE operations in Maine, saying in part, quote, "Given what's happened in Minnesota and elsewhere, I know there are Mainers who are angry and afraid. For now, with so much uncertainty, I urge everyone with a platform to avoid spreading unsubstantiated gossip or fear. In fraught moments, we need to be careful with each other and our community." Meanwhile, we spoke with a member of the Maine legislature who says he absolutely supports federal immigration enforcement operations in the state. Senator Matt Harrington says if people are here illegally, they should be, quote, seen out.
You know, the governor's rhetoric about, protests, I don't think is helpful. Encouraging protests. I think people certainly have a right to peacefully protest, and no one should stand in their way from doing that. There's not a very fine line between that and obstruction of justice, and I think that's where all the issues come in. It's not from people holding signs or yelling on the sidewalks. It's from when people physically obstruct justice, get in the way, move vehicles in front of law enforcement vehicles, get in the way of law enforcement doing their job.